If you asked Burt Reynolds, near the end of his life, to name his biggest regret, it was not a movie he turned down or a stunt that went wrong. It was one woman and one relationship he ended more than 3 decades earlier. In 2015, at the peak of writing his own life story, Reynolds sat down to publish a memoir called But Enough About Me. He could have filled it with car chases, cowboy hats, and the biggest box office years of his career. Instead, he gave an entire chapter to a woman he had not spoken to in years. He called her the love of his life. He called her the one who got away, and he kept saying it in interview after interview until the phrase followed him into his own obituaries. Here is the question worth asking. Not whether Burt Reynolds loved Sally Field. He said that part out loud, in print, on camera, for decades, and nobody who watched him say it ever doubted he meant it. The real question is why the woman he was describing kept saying, in her own words, that the man in his memory was not quite the man she remembered living with. The story starts on a film set in 1976. Reynolds was already one of the biggest box office draws in the country. Field was known mostly for television, for the girl next door parts that had followed her since she was a teenager, and she was hungry to be taken seriously as an actress. They were cast opposite each other in a car chase comedy nobody expected to become a phenomenon, a movie called Smokey and the Bandit. They had known each other only a handful of days before the chemistry became obvious to everyone standing near the camera. Reynolds later said it felt less like 4 days and more like 4 years. Field, in her own telling, felt the same electricity, the same sense that something had clicked into place faster than either of them could explain. The movie became one of the highest-grossing films of the year, beaten at the box office only by a new space adventure called Star Wars. Off-camera, the two leads became one of Hollywood's most watched couples, photographed constantly, asked about constantly, and for a while, the public romance looked exactly like the on-screen one. Magazine covers wanted them together. Talk shows wanted them together. Reynolds was, at that point, arguably the single biggest movie star working anywhere in the world, and the fact that he had chosen his co-star in real life over any of the other women he could have been photographed with only made the story more irresistible to the public that was watching from the outside. Over the next 5 years, they made 3 more films together, Hooper, The End, and Smokey and the Bandit Two. On screen, the pairing worked every single time. Audiences kept buying the romance because for a while it was real. Reynolds proposed marriage more than once during those years. Field turned him down every time, and later said she always sensed his heart was not fully behind the offer, that some part of him wanted the idea of a wife more than the reality of one. That detail matters, because it is the first sign that the two of them were not living inside the same relationship, even while they were living inside the same house, sharing the same films, and being photographed by the same cameras. For a few years, the cracks stayed almost entirely private. Then came the movie that ended things for good. In 1979, Field was offered the lead role in a small drama called Norma Ray, about a textile worker who organizes her factory into a union. It was nothing like the glossy comedies that had made her famous, and nothing like anything Reynolds wanted for her. According to Field's own account, he objected to the character, made a demeaning comment about the woman's past, and threw the script back at her rather than simply saying no. When she pushed back and said she wanted the part anyway, he told her she was letting the whole thing get the better of her, as though wanting to stretch as an actress was some kind of overreaction. Field took the role anyway. She met with the director, signed on, and spent weeks on a factory floor playing a woman with nothing in common with the parts that had made her rich and famous. Reynolds, by her account, then tried to keep her from attending the film's premiere at the Cannes Film Festival, the kind of moment that could define a career. She went regardless. Norma Ray won her the first of 2 Academy Awards for Best Actress, and it happened despite the man she was living with, not because of any support from him. That was the real turning point, more than the award ceremony itself. For years, Field had been introduced as the woman in Burt Reynolds' movies, and by extension, the woman in Burt Reynolds' life. Norma Rae was the first time she stepped fully into her own identity as an actress, on her own terms, against his objections. Field later said that experience marked the beginning of her pulling away from the relationship for good. They stayed together off and on for a little while longer, drifting rather than deciding, but the ending was already written the moment she walked onto that factory set without his blessing. In 1982, they split for the final time. Here is where most love stories from old Hollywood would end, with a breakup, a few gossip columns, and two people quietly moving on with their lives. This one kept going for another 30 years, in two completely different directions, told by two people who had lived through the exact same 5 years and somehow walked away remembering two different relationships. Reynolds never let go of the story he had built about those years. In interview after interview, well into his 70s, he called Field the love of his life, unprompted, long after either of them had married other people and moved on in every visible way. He told one reporter that he did 4 movies with her, spent 5 years with her, and that she was the one who got away. He called ending the relationship one of the biggest disappointments of his life. In his memoir, he devoted pages to their romance, to the chemistry that first sparked on a film set, and to a regret that apparently never faded no matter how much time passed. When journalists brought his comments back to Field, her answers were careful at first and grew more direct over time. She said she was flattered, in the beginning, that a man once so famous kept naming her as his greatest love. She also said Reynolds was, in her words, a complicated man. A phrase she used often enough that it started to sound like a warning rather than a compliment. Later, promoting her own memoir, she went further still. She said Reynolds had reimagined the relationship in his own retelling, that she had not been as important to him in real time as he later claimed once she was gone. She suggested, gently but pointedly, that he simply wanted, in hindsight, to have had the thing he never fully had while they were actually together. Then, in 2018, Field published her own memoir, called In Pieces. It told a very different story than the one Reynolds had spent decades repeating in public. Field wrote that their relationship was often controlling and emotionally difficult in ways she had not fully understood or been able to name at the time it was happening. She connected it to her own childhood, describing years of sexual abuse by her stepfather, the actor and stuntman Jock Mahoney, and suggested that part of what drew her toward Reynolds may have been an old, familiar pattern, rooted in that childhood she was still quietly trying to survive. She also wrote about his struggles with drugs and his declining health, details Reynolds himself had spent years keeping carefully out of public view. Perhaps the single most striking detail in the whole story is this. Field revealed that she had not spoken to Reynolds for roughly the last 30 years of his life. Not a phone call, not a reunion, nothing at all. All while he continued, publicly and repeatedly, to describe her as the love of his life to anyone who would listen. Reynolds died in 2018, the same year Field's memoir was released. Asked about his death, she said he would remain in her history and in her heart for as long as she lived. A careful, generous sentence from a woman who had just spent an entire book explaining why she needed to leave him. She also said, plainly, that she was glad he would never read what she had written about their years together, because it would have hurt him. So, which version is true? The love story he never stopped telling for the rest of his life, or the difficult, complicated years she finally described fully on her own terms, decades later? The honest answer is that both were true, at the same time, for the two people who lived them. Reynolds spent the second half of his life mourning a version of their romance frozen at its very best moment. The 4 days on a film set that felt like 4 years. Field spent those same decades trying to explain, mostly to herself, why she had needed to leave a relationship that looked, from the outside, like the greatest love story Hollywood ever filmed. He called her the one who got away. She called it something closer to a pattern she finally recognized and escaped. Maybe the real ending is that Hollywood's most famous unrequited love story was never actually about two people missing each other across 30 years of silence. It was about one person who never stopped writing the same script in his head, revising the same 5 years until they matched the ending he wished he had, and one person who had already closed the book, put it on a shelf, and built an entirely different life around the space where he used to be. Two people, one relationship, and 30 years of silence in between. Reynolds spent his telling the world what he lost. Field spent hers finally telling the world what it actually cost her to leave. Only one of them ever got to hear the other's version, and by the time hers reached the world, he was already gone.